Welcome to this episode of The Common Sense Skeptic, where we're going to dig into a recent Twitter Space interview of Elon Musk hosted by fanboy Tim Dodd, dealing with Musk's interpretation of events surrounding the Starship maiden launch disaster. This was recorded a week after the 420 crash took place, and many of the statements that Musk made were interesting to say the least. As we go through this virtual exchange of bodily fluids between Musk and Dodd, keeping in mind that Dodd is one of 10 people currently waiting until hell freezes over for his free seat on the Yusaku Maezawa Dear Moon crew mission, we intend to show why and how to interpret a Musk interview conducted by a totally bought and paid for sycophant, and why exactly you should take interviews like this with a pinch of salt, followed by a shot of penicillin. The format started out as a Musk expository rundown, and ended with more of a Q&A session, including questions from a couple of journalists whose name you'll probably recognize. As we go through the hour-long broadcast highlights, we'll timestamp pertinent statements, give you the facts with regards to the points being brought up at the time, and make special notes of the contradictions we can find. Also, while we have been putting this episode together, of course, new information has come to light, and we'll add those tidbits as updates after we show the conclusions we came to before that information was released. And, so we're clear, we are once again going to edit out all the mumbles we can so that a clip that originally sounds like this.
And our first guess would have been that the rock tornado would have caused potentially significant damage to the engines, but
turns into something more like this.
Our first guess would have been that the rock tornado would have caused potentially significant damage to the engines, but
much easier to listen to. But if you think the context of the edit has been changed in any way, feel free to check the entire mumbling, stammering, pregnant pause presentation in its original form yourself. The Twitter Space recording starts off with Musk introducing Dodd, and the first speaker, who isn't properly introduced, Irene Klotz, a senior space editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology. Klotz and Dodd spend the first minute fawning over Musk and the amazing Starship launch, which in their eyes was a huge success. Then Musk launches unprompted into his claims of a successful launch.
The outcome was roughly what I expected. Maybe slightly exceeding my expectations, but roughly what I expected. Or hoped for, I should say, which is that we would get clear of the pad with minimal damage to the pad. And I'm glad to report that the pad damage is actually quite small and looks like it can be repaired quickly.
So that should put everyone at ease, right? This launch, which blasted shrapnel and debris over several square kilometers, obliterated the launch mount foundation, ruptured the tank farm, and had cascading failures of engines resulting in the destruction of the vehicle over Mexican waters, exceeded Musk's expectation. Only minutes into this interview, these statements beg the question: was the FAA, as the licensing agency, aware that this was Musk's expectation when the FAA hastily granted a launch license for this event the week prior? In Musk's assessment, the level of destruction to the OLM was minimal. Very little damage to the pad and can be repaired quickly, he says. The question there, of course, is what pad? There is no pad left under the OLM. It's completely gone. But more on that later. Musk continues on about the collection of data that SpaceX claims to have collected.
We would also get significant in-flight data, particularly with respect to the pressurizing of the tanks with the propellant liquids. So that actually looked quite good.
Now, here's the thing. As you'll see as this interview continues, it becomes pretty damned obvious that they were not able to collect nearly as much data, even from the engine failures, as you would expect. And if they are relying on their own telemetry banner, or the monitoring equipment feeding the information to the telemetry banner, that information is going to be flawed, since we already know that the Super Heavy engine diagram stopped reacting properly after the sixth failure. By our count, at least 11 Raptors quit before the machine entered the death spiral, but the graphic was frozen after it reverted back to showing only 5 units out. At 2:20, Musk continues.
We also went supersonic. That was no problem at all.
At launch, there were 33 rocket engines strapped to the bottom of this cylinder. You should have been able to cinch these to a garbage skip and still hit Mach 1 with ease. Hell, they do something very similar at rocket sled test ranges all the time with wedges on rails, so really not a big deal. The question is, can you get to that benchmark intact? And obviously, Starship could not. The rocket was already missing at least 6, possibly 8 Raptors by the time this vehicle went supersonic, and the time it took to reach Mach 1 was a full minute longer than it took shuttle. Of course, Starship never went hypersonic as intended either, meaning Mach 5 or faster. A threshold shuttle crossed at 241 into flight at a similar altitude to the apogee of this particular launch.
So I'm going through obviously some good news items here. The vehicle structural margins appear to be better than we expected. As we can tell by the fact that the vehicle is actually doing somersaults towards the end and still staying intact.
As you can see, in the end, the combined vehicle did not stay intact, and it was structural failure that finally caused the terminal explosions of the flight.
From a rocket standpoint and pad standpoint, we are probably ready to launch in 6 to 8 weeks.
All we're going to say about this 6 to 8 week claim now is that we're going to have a bunch to say about it later, but for now let's continue.
The longest lead item on that is probably requalification of the flight termination system, because we did initiate the flight termination system, but it took way too long to rupture the tanks. So we need more detonation cord to unzip the tanks at altitude and ensure that basically the rocket explodes immediately.
What was the time lag?
I think it was on the order of 40 seconds-ish.
Requalification of an FTS system is not a process that moves quickly, and from what we saw in a previous analysis video from the ineffectiveness of the one used, a new system would have to start from scratch, so you're talking months, not weeks. Now in this segment, we can clear up a couple common comments made in our previous video comment section. First, it's obvious they intended for the FTS to blast the rocket out of the sky, which it did not. That's what we concluded in the video. Second, there were comments made about how the FTS is automated by mandate of the FAA, and that this event was automatically triggered. Musk is contradicting the assertion that this was an automated event by saying it was triggered from the ground at their discretion. When FTS was triggered, it took too long to rupture the tanks. The delay between instruction and tank rupture was, according to Musk, about 40 seconds. So the suggestion this launch included a successful test of the FTS is not truthful. FTS failed and has to be redesigned, and then it has to be requalified, including, according to Musk, much more detonation cord to unzip the tanks and destroy the vehicle instantaneously.
I'll go through a bunch of notables. At liftoff, there were 3 engines that we chose not to start that hit aborts, and so we actually lifted off with 30 engines, which is the minimum number of engines. Those engines did not explode, but the system didn't think they were healthy enough to bring them to full thrust, so they were shut down.
Prior to T-0, Mission Control detected that 3 engines on Booster 7 were not healthy that were indicating abort, but Musk chose to launch anyway. An abort today to conduct maintenance on those 3 engines may have increased their odds a week from now, but Musk would have lost his all-important 420. Also, a 10% failure rate in Raptor's pre-ignition does not speak well for reliability whatsoever. Let's assume what Musk is saying here is true. Although given the state of the immediate vicinity, there's absolutely no chance Raptors weren't bombarded with debris upon ignition. And according to photos of the back end of the ship, those engines that weren't firing were missing their nozzles altogether. Even if true, and 30 is the operational minimum number of engines required to conduct the mission, when this lifted off, there was automatically zero margin for error. As soon as one more engine craps out, you're facing total mission failure. And that's what happened only 27 seconds later.
Then at T plus 27 seconds, engine 19 lost communications, concurrent with some kind of energetic event that liberated the outer heat shield from the engines 17, 18, 19, and 20 area. You can see this on video, actually.
The energetic event which liberates the outer heat shields of engines 17, 18, 19, and 20 occurred at this point of the launch. Now we know what number engines are in that area, and that the material falling away is the heat shield for 4 engines. Not even a minute into a flight that already started off with 3 dead units, and now the margin for error has definitely been exceeded.
This is the SpaceX best assessment after a week. So something bad happened at T plus 27 seconds because engine 19 lost all communications and some kind of explosion happened to knock out the heat shields of engines 17, 18, 19, and 20. At T plus 62 seconds, we see additional aft heat shield damage near engine 30. However, the engine continues to run. And then at T 85 seconds is where things really hit the fan. We see engine 6 with loss of communication to thrust vector control. From this point onwards, we lose thrust vector control of the rocket, so we lose steering.
T plus 85 seconds is when they lost control of the rocket, no longer able to steer it. The flight exploded at almost the 4-minute mark, which would be the 240-second mark. Let's see what the announcers were telling viewers around the T plus 85 mark, shall we?
The velocity increases. The density of the atmosphere is decreasing.
Max Q.
Lessening stress on the vehicle. The call out, Max Q now. Continuing to watch the first stage as we head downrange. 100 seconds into flight. Our next major activity is going to be shutdown of the first stage.
Before Houston announced acquisition of signal, Starship was already no longer steerable. At T plus 85 seconds, the vehicle was moving 915 kilometers per hour at an elevation of 10 kilometers. Ground control allowed that flight to continue to an elevation of 39 kilometers to speeds over 2100 kilometers per hour. Given the proximity to populated areas in both the US and Mexico, that seems beyond irresponsible.
What's your best guess as to what caused the initial engine issues? And then I guess it cascaded after that, but what do you think happened?
I think we don't know with certainty. We did generate quite the rock tornado at the base of the vehicle. Our first guess would have been that the rock tornado would have caused potentially significant damage to the engines, but we weirdly do not see evidence of the rock tornado actually damaging engines or heat shields in a material way.
This really does seem a ridiculous statement to make, given not only the state of the OLM and pad, but also the subsequent cascading failure of the rocket itself. You might not have a video screenshot of a chunk of fondag shattering pieces of the engine compartment, nor would you possibly expect to get such a shot in this maelstrom of destruction using normal cameras, but you can certainly infer from the extreme damage to the pad, and the video capturing tons of cement getting hurled straight up the side of the rocket, that the engine compartment did not escape injury. However, if it truly didn't catch any damage from the launch, as Musk suggests here, that only means that scenario can no longer be used as an excuse, and his rocket behaved that much worse all on its own. You can't have it both ways. But now Musk has some comments to make about the Raptor engines on Booster 7.
The engines on Booster 7 were built over a long period of time, so each engine was a little bit of a unique item, whereas the engines on Booster 9, which is next, are much newer and more consistent, and really with significant reliability improvements over Booster 7. So I think we'll see a much more robust engine situation with Booster 9.
Now we find out that the 33 Raptors they strapped to Booster 7 were pretty much all the older, mismatched, unreliable engines in the inventory, all built at different times. Why waste all the good, reliable units they're putting on Booster 9 for the maiden launch the entire world would be watching, right? Just clear out all the old inventory. Nobody will know the difference. And to be fair, until he told us this factoid, nobody did. Probably not even the FAA when they granted the launch license. But it gets better as he keeps going.
The shields, which are both force and heat shields around the engines for Booster 9 are much better because they weren't retrofitted. Booster 7, we kind of retrofitted heat shields, whereas Booster 9 is designed in.
Okay, the jury-rigged shielding on 7 and got blasted off sucked, and 9 is supposed to be better because it's built in and not retrofitted. Anything else?
It was actually just good to get this vehicle off the ground because we've made so many improvements to Booster 9 and beyond. We really just needed to fly this vehicle and then move on to the much improved Booster 9.
So Musk pretty much just needed to get rid of this Frankenstein vehicle to make room for Booster 9. And it looks like he even managed to dump this trashy ICBM into Mexican domestic waters without anybody saying a damn thing about it. Win-win. Next point brought up by Musk is this.
So the thing that we want to make sure of probably most with the next flight is that any kind of central nexus that controls multiple engines is extremely robust and with extra shielding so that we don't have a single point that can take out multiple engines. And for sure, we don't want a single point that can take out thrust vector control, which is engine steering.
Now to the layman's ear, that sounds like Booster 7 was designed so poorly that the failure of one component could take out multiple engines and steering. And they now have to fix that in Booster 9 somehow. It also sounds like a design that would not have passed muster in the first place at any other rocket company ever. Zach from CSI Starbase asked a two-part question that was probably more important than he thought it was. Tell you why after Musk answers.
Two-part question, like what actually triggers second stage ignition? And also the second part of that question, did Ship 24 attempt to light its engines after the destruction of Booster 7?
When flight termination is executed, it's executed on both. So the ship currently does not attempt to save itself. Arguably, maybe it should. That's a good point.
Yes, inarguably, Starship should try to save itself, or else this thing is never getting human rated. Or did you forget the fact that a crew abort scenario still has to be worked out with this craft? During the Starship 2022 update, Musk even touched on this, suggesting, without showing, that the Starship itself would be able to react quickly enough to rocket away from a booster disaster scenario.
The Starship will not have an independent abort system, but I think something that would make sense is to have the thruster weight of the ship be enough that it could take off from the booster even if the booster has a failure at the pad level.
That seems unlikely, but that was the pitch a year ago. So let it be known that as of April 27, 2023, no consideration for saving the Starship in the case of a failure has been contemplated, when they have already taken money in 2018 for a human flight around the moon they have yet to make good on. Now, we've taken out most of Dodd's fawning in this interview, but he pipes up with this comment and embarrasses himself.
Yeah, it's crazy. It looks like the engine's lit after the booster let go and after the booster finally blew up. Like there's what looks like.
Then, unfortunately, the recorded audio cuts out for 15 seconds, and whatever answer Musk gave him is lost to everyone listening. But if Tim would like to show us where, in the 2 seconds between explosions, after the ship started folding in half, where he saw Starship try to ignite engines to save itself, we'd love to see him try. And when Musk comes back on, he's talking about another big difference between Booster 7 and Booster 9.
The big things that are important for the next flight are isolation of thrust vector control, which with the Booster 9 is a lot easier because we use electric motors to steer the engines as opposed to hydraulic actuators where you've got a common manifold between the hydraulic actuators. So if you lose hydraulic pressure, you can lose multiple engines, essentially.
So one more reason why Booster 7 is inferior to Booster 9. Completely different steering controls. Isolated electric motors versus common manifold hydraulics. So the next wreck that Mexico has to clean up won't have to deal with leaking hydraulic fluid. How considerate of them. Now, is anyone else wondering at this point if anybody from the FAA so much as laid eyes on Booster 7 before certifying it for launch? But now it's time to talk about upgrading the pad. And Irene opens that conversation with these rapid-fire questions in a row.
Elon, since you've gone ahead and excavated your launch mount a bit, I assume you're going to go ahead and put in that steel grid and the water deluge. Do you think that will fully address the issue of the wider than expected debris field? And are you expecting any pushback from environmental and kind of community groups that this event did put debris where it wasn't expected?
Musk's answer and failure to answer these questions tells you everything you need to know about how seriously he's taking the damage he caused to the surrounding area. He could not give a shit.
I mean, the debris is really just, basically sand and rock. So it's not like, not toxic at all or anything. It's just, it's like a sandstorm, essentially, basically a human-made sandstorm. But we don't want to do that again.
A human-created sandstorm, he calls it. Well, here's some news from Mr. Musk. Pulverized concrete dust is not sand. Sand falling 10 miles away in Port Isabel is bad enough, but the dark cloud carrying jagged microscopic fragments of launch pad that settles into people's and animals' lungs is a serious health concern. And adding that mixture of non-native aggregate calcium aluminate dust to the local environment, covering algal flats and vegetation and animals, and mixing in with the water those animals drink, well, that ought to keep the environmentalists quite busy tallying up the long-term damage caused by this one single launch. So here's his genius plan to avoid this from happening again, which is bound to work out just as well as any of his other failed genius plans.
We're going to be putting down basically a water-jacketed sandwich. That's 2 layers of very thick plate steel that are also sort of perforated on the upper side so that you have what is basically a massive, super strong steel shower head pointing up. And then the water pressure coming out of there has to exceed the engine's thrust is exerting on the steel plate beneath the launch stand. So which is all doable, and we should not have a rock tornado with the next flight.
A steel plate perforated with holes using an extruded liquid to cool down the surface in a high heat environment. Where have we heard that before? Well, yeah, that's another one of the genius ideas that never worked out on this same vehicle. One of the early claims Musk made, which got him all sorts of undeserved positive press about this craft, was that instead of using heat tiles to stave off the heat caused by re-entry, the skin of Starship was either going to ooze water, or the later claim was it was going to ooze propellant through thousands of tiny holes in the ship's outer skin. His minions cheered on his genius. The rest of us knew exactly what to think of it. It's actually not far off his Hyperloop stupidity, when he claimed Hyperloop was like an air hockey table in a vacuum tube, a concept so easy his interns could work it out. And that worked out so well, they even tore out the Hyperloop test track that they used for the annual competitions, which to date also yielded no useful technology. Anyway, according to Musk, they're going to install a mega steel sandwich, between the plates of which water will flow before being forced out of a 10 or so meter wide shower head, at pressures comparable to the forces bearing down at them from the rocket. Who comes up with this stuff? There's a CGI artist named Ryan Hansen, and he seems to hang on Musk's every word. He shared a series of renders where he takes what Musk said and tries to visualize this for people. These are some of the pics he's come up with so far, and they depict a plate top and bottom with honeycombing in between them to allow water to circulate. In this one, he also has water bubbling up out of the pad, which of course would get blasted out of the way immediately upon rocket ignition. And this isn't really what Musk said in the interview anyway. Musk wants a 100 square meter shower head, shooting jets of water into the engine compartment with enough force to counter the rocket engines bearing down on it. Again, this is what the plate is staring down. And that sounds like a wonderful environment for the electric motors that are supposed to be replacing the hydraulic control mechanisms. Basically, you need to ask yourself this question. If you're standing in front of this with a fire hose from 50 feet away, what size of fire hose do you need to have to stop the force before it gets to you? Then the second question is, are you going to be able to hold that fire hose? Newton's law regarding actions and reactions suggests that fire hose is going to throw you around like a rag doll. So if this plate manages to shoot water out the top of it with enough force to counter 33 Raptor engines at takeoff, does that not mean the plate would now be exerting that same amount of force downwards into the foundation? If water is getting shot out of one end of an object, that object tends to move the other way. And if that plate presses down with that type of force, what is it going to be crushing? Well, if you take a look at the work done on the site to date, and account for the fact that instead of cutting out the twisted rebar, they instead straightened it, you have to expect that they're going to be pouring concrete again for the plate to sit on. Which means if the water is unable to hold back the forces of the rocket, and the rockets are able to get underneath the plate, and or if the plate itself crushes the structure it's sitting on, not only is the concrete scenario going to be played out again, these steel plates are also going to get thrown about as additional shrapnel. Okay, let's go back to this model from Ryan Hansen, since it shows a pattern of holes meant for the water to get forced up out of. We'll count up one section and multiply by 6, since the pad represents a hexagon. In this section, there's 112 individual holes, making a total on the pad of 672 holes, or about 20 water nozzles per Raptor engine in the booster. Now, in comparison, this is a test of the water deluge system at the SLS launch site at Kennedy's Pad 39B. It uses 450,000 gallons, or about 1.7 million liters of water, to knock down the sound energy and vibrations of the massive SLS rocket launch. SLS is rated at 39 meganewtons maximum thrust. Super Heavy Booster is rated at 72 meganewtons, so to keep the ratio about the same, you're looking at having about 830,000 gallons, or 3.14 million liters of water to keep the noise and vibrations in check, ignoring the exponential qualities of sound pressure level. Meaning each hole in the pad we're looking at would need to be responsible for 1,235 gallons of water in a matter of seconds. No diameter on the hole was provided, so PSI, etc. are left to the imagination. But let's do a little math and see what it might come to. To work out PSI, multiply the gallons per minute by 4, then divide by pi times the diameter squared measured in feet. Let's say the total deluge cycle takes 15 seconds to complete. Multiply the 1235 by 4 to get to a minute, then by 4 again according to the formula, and the numerator comes in at 19,760. On an exit with a diameter of 1 foot, the denominator is simply pi, giving a result of 6,300 psi per hole. On an exit with a diameter of half a foot, the denominator gets cut in quarters and the resulting PSI is over 25,000 PSI, which is approaching the 30,000 PSI used by water cutting jets. Which brings us to another point about the deluge system at Kennedy. This entire stream is gravity fed from the water tower on site. There are no pumps in this delivery system at all. But if Musk is going to try to pull this off, he will have to rely entirely on pumps to get the job done. The question is, do they even make pumps that can handle that kind of volume? And the short answer is no. No, they don't. We know by comparison that to mitigate sound and vibrations the same way as Kennedy does for the SLS, they're looking at providing 830,000 gallons of water to the pad in about 15 seconds. So 3.32 million gallons or 12.6 million liters per minute. That's 210,000 liters, 210 tons of water per second. And the world's most powerful water pump, according to this 2021 article and a Guinness Book of World Records, is capable of delivering roughly 1/4 that volume at 60,000 liters or 60 tons of water per second. And to operate, it requires 4 megawatts of power. Musk would need 4 of these units in Boca Chica to replicate what Kennedy does with gravity. But it's about time we put an end to this water-cooled pad nonsense anyway. Has anybody asked why Musk is trying to reinvent the water wheel where rocket launches are concerned? Because that answer is actually very simple. When Musk announced his intentions to grow his operations in Boca Chica, he discovered SpaceX would have to work with the Army Corps of Engineers to mitigate the effects such operations would have on the local area, resulting in SpaceX filing permit application SWG 2012-00381. The Corps asked for public input on March 4th of 2021. In May of 2021, the Corps wrote to SpaceX outlining concerns from the public, also from the US EPA, the US FWS, the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality, and the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Musk ignored the letter and continued to build up Boca Chica without cooperating with the Corps in any way. So, on March 7th of 2022, the Department of the Army sent SpaceX another letter telling them that their permit application was being withdrawn due to lack of contact, no response to the public concerns, and no compensatory mitigation plan for the works that were being suggested. Which means, among other things, Musk cannot build a water deluge system. Such a system requires fresh water, not salt water, and that water cannot be released into the estuaries surrounding the Boca Chica launch site. It would have to be caught and held in holding and settling ponds, the same as it is at Kennedy. This is the Starship OLM location, and this is the border between it and the protected nature preserves. There is absolutely no room to build holding and settling ponds for any sort of deluge system. So what is Musk's big plan here? Well, remember that time Musk made flamethrowers for the Boring Company, but selling flamethrowers is actually illegal since they're a prohibited weapon? So he labeled them not a flamethrower, and he got away with it? Or at Tesla, how his full self-driving program didn't actually produce cars that were full self-driving, and according to the company, in legal filings, that system will never exceed an ADAS Level 2 rating. Or how Musk told the FAA that the launch tower he was building at Boca Chica without a permit wasn't actually a launch tower. The exact same thing is happening here. This mega steel water plate idea is Musk's version of not a water deluge system. We're guessing that Musk figures if he doesn't build a normal water deluge system like every other grown-up launch site has, and if he calls it something different like a water-cooled mega steel pancake, then he'll be off the hook with the Army Corps of Engineers. So now the question is, are the Army Corps of Engineers a bunch of pussies who are going to tolerate an end run like that? How stupid does Musk think they are? And what is the punishment going to be when Musk tries activating this ridiculous system and pollutes the local environment with 1 million gallons of fresh water runoff because it's pretty obvious he has no intentions of building the ponds that are required? Musk had the ability to do things properly at Boca Chica with the assistance of the Army Corps of Engineers, and he refused to play ball. Just like at his Twitter headquarters, where he's now under fire for breaking local and federal laws related to the building occupied by Twitter, where he refuses to pay rent. Musk's pattern is obvious. You only have to open your eyes to see it. Time for the obvious question then.
Joey from Reuters, why couldn't you install that before this launch? Was that a technical reason or a regulatory reason?
It wasn't ready. It's not like we expected. If we'd expected to dig a hole, we would not have flown.
That answer is so telling. The water-cooled steel plate wasn't installed because it wasn't ready in time. This would indicate that Musk's launch schedule for this date superseded readiness of the platform. He also says they didn't expect to excavate a hole in the pad, so this would be contradictory to his claims at the top, when he said this event exceeded his expectations. The question is, why didn't they think this would dig a hole?
We'd done a static fire of the booster, and that had just resulted in fairly modest erosion of the high-strength concrete at the base, which is called fondag. Basically the strongest, highest temperature form of concrete that you can get, steel reinforced and everything. We thought it would be fine for one launch. We would erode some amount of the concrete, but that it would be fine. We certainly didn't expect to shatter the concrete.
This really illustrates the problems you're likely to encounter when you think this is a suitable static fire for testing your rocket equipment. This is shit. The only thing you can learn from shit is more shit. Now, even this short burst, without two engines running, and the others all running at half thrust, encountered some erosion, according to Musk. But obviously, this gave his team absolutely no indication what they had in store for them on launch day. And that's really all that needs to be said. Their level of testing was obviously completely inadequate. And anybody watching this who knew anything at all about rocket launches knew it was completely inadequate. But let's also touch on the comments Musk made about fondag, this concrete that Musk calls the strongest in the world. He often makes claims like this, and then they generally turn out to be bullshit. This one is no exception. Structural engineers or concrete experts can weigh in the comments about the properties of fondag or pure calcium aluminate concrete, but here's what we found. Fondag is indeed marketed as a high-strength, high-temperature concrete, which, after curing, has a compressive strength of 8 to 9,000 psi, or about 55 to 60 megapascals, with resistance to extreme temperatures up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Simply put, that's not even close to the strongest concretes in the world, known as UHPCs or ultra-high-performance concretes, such as those to produce bridge beams. They dwarf fondag compressive strength numbers, requiring a minimum rating of 17,000 psi, or 120 megapascals, and ratings can exceed 29,000 psi, or 200 megapascals, leaving fondag in their dust. And obviously, fondag wasn't up to the task. So it will be interesting to see what concrete Musk uses to fill in that hole to put this steel pancake on top of. Joey continues with the next obvious question.
Why the steel pancake over like a flame trench or something like that?
Well, you could do it either way, and there's different schools of thought there. The important thing is that you have a regeneratively cooled, wherever the flame is hitting, that is regeneratively and evaporatively cooled.
First off, there are not two schools of thought about this where heavy lift rockets are concerned. Tory Bruno set people straight on this through a tweet he put out last week, describing how flame diverters and flame trenches are a given at the top end of rocketry. And just as an FYI, we would take pretty much anything Tory has to say at face value, given his and his company's track record. He's probably the straightest shooter and least egotistical CEO in the aerospace sector. And the people working at SpaceX in 2014, when they were pitching Starbase to the state of Texas, knew that flame trenches were important, which is why they have one under the Falcon Heavy in this artist rendering from their cover page of the proposal. Musk's claim that this plate will be regeneratively cooled is absolutely laughable, just as the seeping skin idea on a Starship was. If you take the heat and force from the ass end of that rocket and point it at a water source, you're going to get steam. And the expansion of water into steam at those temperatures is upwards of 4,000 times expansion. To visualize that concept, here's a 1 liter bottle of water, and to scale when it expands into steam, it will fill 4 or more of these 1-ton totes. This conversion happens at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius, compared to the temperature of the Raptor blast furnace above it. As soon as that expansion gets forced back into the plate, the sandwich of metal will very quickly separate, first destroying the plate, then the strata underneath it. It's completely predictable. Just as an example of what happens when water is introduced to a high heat environment, this is what happens when damp scrap metal is added to a blast furnace. The explosion happens within seconds, and with great force. If a similar force lifts just one of the plates that Musk intends to lay down, that's game over. So we have an update to add since SpaceX was kind enough to provide this YouTube clip through their Twitter account. This 20-second clip shows a standalone metal plate spraying jets of water towards a Raptor of unknown variant. Of course, the sycophant channels and muskrats oohed and awed about this clip, but we're not so sure they saw what we saw, so let's back it up and go through it. Without knowing the amount of water coming through this system, either in terms of gallons per minute or pressure, upon ignition, the rocket engine has absolutely no issues penetrating right through the water veil. You can see the plate getting blasted immediately by the plasma stream. There's some debate online as to whether or not the engine was even firing at full thrust, given the orange hue of the flame versus a proper blue-purple methane flame. The orange in a flame could be from a fuel-rich burn, or maybe it's interacting with the steam or dust on the site. Either way, the flame smashes right into the water-cooled plate and instantly, explosively, vaporizes any water it comes into contact with. The plate in the video appears to reach white-hot temperature, which means the water has done nothing to prevent it from heating up and thereby expanding and warping. And it would appear the flames had the ability to penetrate deep into the water system, since it takes about 4 seconds to resume flowing at full strength after the rocket shuts off. Even then, the water stream looks quite different than it did at the beginning of the test, but the video fades out here, obviously on purpose, and we never get the opportunity to see clearly the damage or warpage done to the plate or to the surrounding area. This is the last frame in the video before rocket ignition. This is the last frame in the video before the end fade, after 5 seconds of recovery. These two spray patterns are not even remotely similar, and that would indicate damage to the plate system. Also, you can see a good amount of steam coming off the back of the plate stand. Now remember when we said earlier their static fire tests were shit, and all you can learn from shit is more shit. Well, this test is also shit, although we can obviously already tell that the system won't do what Musk expects it to. So why is this test total garbage? Well, for starters, there is no background at the plate stand, so a lot of the energy and pressure created by the rocket is going right by the stand and not being absorbed into the local area, or it's being reflected off at 90 degrees into nowhere. This in no way resembles how the plate would be used. The system, as described by Musk, is sat flat under the rocket with 33 Raptors bearing down on it, hitting an unknown number of plates. Each of those plates will expand differently, and they will warp under this type of punishment. As soon as that happens, the entire system will likely rupture, and if those plates are tied directly into the legs may be compromised. So for those muskrat channels heralding this demonstration as amazing, we're going to take the exact opposite opinion based on what we observed, that this is another failed experiment. Then Musk makes a comment about the acoustic environment, but only in regards to the payload in the upper stage.
The acoustic environment is worse with a flat plate, as you might imagine, but the payload is 400 feet away from where the plume is impinging. So it's so far away that the acoustics are not that bad in the payload variant.
He seems to have little, if any, clue what effect sound pressure levels are capable of doing at the bottom end of the rocket. Without the heat, those SPLs alone are capable of shattering objects and instantly boiling water.
We're going to extend the steel beyond just underneath the rocket because we want to make sure we don't sort of dig up concrete elsewhere. We're going to connect the load of the massive steel sandwich underneath the launch pad into the launch mount legs.
Tying the steel into the legs seems like another bad idea. That means any forces that happen to blow the steel pancake top apart due to expansion of the water or expansion of the steel or any other failure would be transferred to the legs directly, and that seems like yet another recipe for disaster. If there are structural engineers out there that would like to weigh in on this opinion, that's what the comment section is for. We're guessing here, but since bridge deck plates, for example, float so that their expansion plates can work together and not ram into each other, we're thinking that the forces acting against a monolithic metal plate expanding outwards directly across the legs of the superstructure is probably not ideal. Tim chimes in again at the 2135 mark.
What things do you think went better than you expected and what things went worse than you expected? I mean, getting past Max Q is a pretty big deal. I was actually quite shocked.
That's for sure an important milestone.
Both of them are under the impression that the ship made it through max Q, right around the time the vehicle lost steering at T plus 79 seconds.
As the velocity increases, the density of the atmosphere is decreasing.
Max Q.
Lessening stress on the vehicle. The call out, max Q now.
Moving only 840 kilometers per hour, far short of Mach 1, at an elevation of only 9 kilometers. Musk reported the ship lost vector control 6 seconds later. Now again, maybe they actually did make max Q at that timestamp, but max Q and Mach 1 are often side by side in the callouts of a rocket launch. As an example, ULA didn't have a full readout of their telemetry information for their Delta IV NROL-91 launch, but max Q and Mach 1 are called out in quick succession at approximately T plus 80.
Vehicle is now passing through max Q, maximum dynamic pressure. Mach 1, Delta IV is now supersonic.
Electron is supersonic.
The much smaller Rocket Lab's Electron rocket goes supersonic at 7.8 kilometers altitude, which is 15 seconds before it hits max Q at 13 kilometers, while moving 1,671 kilometers per hour.
Cleared max Q.
Mach 1 before it hits max Q. And the Falcon Heavy supersonic call is again immediately followed by the max Q call, both right around the T plus 60 second.
Around the T plus 40 second
Vehicle
mark.
supersonic.
In preparation for max Q.
Max Q.
The vehicle moving in excess of 1,200 kilometers per hour at an elevation under 10 kilometers. That means the max Q callout milestone that Tim and Musk are gushing over here was likely false, and was just the radio voices reading from a script based on a timeline rather than instrumentational readings. Max Q might have been achieved later in the flight, when the rocket went supersonic at T plus 145, at a point in time when it was no longer able to be steered, but that was not the callout, and anything after T plus 85, according to Musk, the mission was doomed. So when he makes this claim, this is also nonsense.
And it got pretty close to stage separation. If we had maintained thrust vector control and throttled up, because we needed to compensate, we'd lost too many engines, so we needed to make up for the missing ones. But if we'd throttled up the remaining engines and maintained thrust vector control, we would have made it to staging.
Yeah, if you hadn't lost control, and if you hadn't lost so many engines, and if the other engines could have compensated, and if you'd crossed your fingers and prayed hard enough, you might have been able to make it to staging. But none of that happened, so saying Starship almost made it there is beyond disingenuous. Only people dumb enough to volunteer for a Neuralink device would believe a statement like that. At 24:25, Irene Klotz is back with another question.
Elon, would you change the flight profile all, and what would you have to do to actually reach orbit as opposed to the 146 miles that this one seemed like that would have been the max altitude?
I'd say I think we've got a better than 50% chance of reaching orbit on the next flight. Yeah, we're just going to do a repeat, basically.
Cool. So 50% chance of success doing the same thing over again. That's how rocket companies work, right? CEO says it's a coin flip, so that's an automatic green light for everybody. Can someone at ULA confirm that's how you do things? From here, and for the next several minutes, Musk waxes poetic about the Soviet N-1 rocket. We've cut it down to the highlights for you.
I always recommend people read the history of the N-1 program, which was the competitor rocket to the Saturn V. The Soviets were really at their A game. I mean, they were just fantastic. So they had A-plus players. It's fair to say that their motivation was maximized. Success means you're a hero of the Soviet Union. Failure, you're probably going to the gulag. And still, the N-1 failed. It never reached orbit. The N-1 is the closest to Starship of any rocket that's flown. Starship is actually a bit more risky in some ways, in that we've got a cryogenic fuel. It's always harder to deal with cryogenic fuel that is liquid at room temperature. We're running a higher chamber pressure engine that's full flow stage combustion, so it's the most complex and difficult engine configuration, but the one with the highest efficiency. We're using autogenous pressurization, which I don't think they did. And our scale is also bigger, so we're about twice the mass and about 60% more thrust than an N-1.
So your takeaways here are, Musk has great respect for dictatorial space programs that can imprison people who don't meet insane job performance requirements. Starship and N-1 are closely related. N-1 never made it to orbit, and for several reasons, Starship is inherently more risky and dangerous than N-1 ever was. N-1, of course, being the second largest non-nuclear explosion in history. Now, regarding the reliability of a rocket with a lot of engines.
If you've got a rocket with a lot of engines, as we do, if you have extremely good engine isolation, that if an engine fails, it does not cause a failure of neighboring engine or the stage itself, you have a very robust design. Because then, if you lose one of 33 engines, that's a 3% thrust loss. It's not a big deal. But if you do not have good engine isolation and an engine failure domino to other engines or to parts of the stage, then you have an extremely unreliable design.
When we look at the bottom of Booster 7, what we don't see is engine isolation. These things have barely any separation between them at all. And, according to Musk, if an engine failure can cascade to a neighboring engine, then the design is flawed, as Booster 7 must be, because these engine failures are clustered in pairs. 4 pairs of engines were dead by the time the vehicle started exhibiting obvious loss of control. Is this not confirmation of a poor design, using Musk's own words? Okay, moving on, Irene is back at 3120 with a question that Musk should have been expecting, but obviously wasn't. And without comment, we're just going to give the question she asked and every stammer of the response that Musk gave her.
Do you expect Starship HLS to be the long pole for Artemis 3?
No, I definitely don't. I think we will be the first thing to really be. I think we will be that we will not be a limiting factor at all.
That's how Musk sounds when his brain tires are mired in the muck, and the answer he gave was wrong. Absolutely, without question, Starship will be the long hold on Artemis 3. SLS has already flown, and Artemis 2 announced their crew recently. They're good to go. Meanwhile, in Boca Chica, Joey from Reuters is back.
Elon, how much do you expect to spend in this kind of prototype development phase before one of these starships actually starts flying real payloads, whether, Starlink or otherwise? And how many kind of tests are you targeting before that?
That was a great question. Listen to Musk dodge it with half a dozen tangents.
Well, I'm hopeful we can get 4 flights out this year, maybe 5. I would be surprised if we exit this year without getting to orbit. I'd say it's not 100% probability, but I think we've probably got an 80% plus probability of reaching orbit this year, and close to 100% chance of reaching orbit within 12 months. The thing to bear in mind is SpaceX is actually quite good at production, the best in history of any rocket maker with production. I mean, we're making a Falcon 9 upper stage every 3 or 4 days. We're actually slowed it down slightly because we've got more Raptors than we know what to do with. We're actually focusing a bit more on the Raptor side on upgrades, mostly to improve the reliability and robustness of the engine.
The question wasn't answered, so let's try again.
And the cost of all this, I guess how much do you expect to spend on all that either this year or before you start flying real payloads?
Be a couple $2 billion this year, $2 billion-ish, all in on Starship.
Finally, a clean answer. Starship alone is costing the company $2 billion per year. We're going to come back to this because there is a part 2 to the question now.
And there's a struggle by other companies to raise funds lately for a number of reasons, and SpaceX has usually kind of been insulated from that. Do you see any kind of difference nowadays? Is SpaceX kind of thinking about fundraising differently, and does that affect how, the pressure on this Starship program at all?
We do not anticipate needing to raise funding. We don't think we need to raise funding. We'll do our standard thing where we provide liquidity to employees who are in stock. To the best of my knowledge, we do not need to raise incremental funding for SpaceX.
Well, that ought to give the venture capitalists that Musk has been bleeding dry every couple of months a sigh of relief. See, every 3 to 6 months, Musk has needed another $1 billion or so to keep the lights on. Those capital raises are publicly published, and you can see how many times Musk has gone back to the trough for more money. But Musk says he doesn't need to raise funding despite a $2 billion annual burn rate. Guess Starlink must be raking in the cash for them, hey? Well, no. According to Starlink, it currently has 1.5 million subscribers worldwide, enjoying laggy, gappy, data-capped satellite service, and Starlink lost its $1 billion grant from the FCC. A Starlink subscription in the US costs $110 per month, and less in some other parts of the world, but let's say it's $110 for everyone. That's a cool $1.98 billion in gross receipts annually. Right off the top, we can remove the 32 launches Musk could have sold at $55 million each, so their loss of opportunity on those is $1.76 billion. And as of November of 2022, there were 3,271 Starlink satellites in orbit at an estimated cost of $500,000 each, so there's another $1.635 billion spent. it's fair to say that Starlink is not financing Starship. Like, not at all. Nor can it possibly be turning a profit at these levels after you count the loss leader on outset terminal purchases, wages, leases, advertising, and every other business expense of a third-party telecommunications provider, not the least of which would be the data rate for the local ISPs where the ground stations are located. But Musk is telling these guys he's spending $2 billion a year on Starship and he doesn't need your cash. So, all you venture capitalists listening, make sure you pay attention and don't give him any. One final thing here, because one of the favorite things that muskrats like telling people is that Starship will be able to get 100 tons of payload to orbit for $2 million per launch. Good luck making that math work when Musk failed to deliver a single ounce to orbit for 1,000 times that amount spent in the past year, with far more spending yet to come. Amortized across total development costs, the numbers are going to be laughably higher than what his minions have been made to believe. The next question from John Krause puts to rest theories spun by Musk fanboy channels like Scott Manley regarding the wonky ascent from the pad.
Yeah, I have a fun question. So the lean off the pad, was that intentional? Was it more than you thought it might be? Was it related to the engines out? And do you expect to do that on like future more operational launches?
It's related to the engines out, and we do not normally expect to lean. It should be aspirationally going straight up.
That is the end of this argument. There was no pad avoidance maneuver. There was no pre-planned lean. The thing took off at a 5-degree angle before it corrected because Musk elected to launch with 3 dead engines. So all you muskrats out there, quit trying to attribute to brilliance what can just as easily be chalked up to stupidity, because it is normally stupidity. At 3550, Musk makes a comment about the best way to launch the vehicle, which includes a useful stat, if it is accurate.
There's a debate of, do you keep the rocket over the pad, in which case there's more cooking of the base, or do you start moving sideways sooner? If you move sideways sooner, you are moving that big cutting torch across the launch ring. Like, we have big steel plates over the top of the launch ring. I think, depending on how close the engines are, they erode that steel at a roughly 0.5 inch to 1 inch per second.
Now plot this erosion information against the steel plate he wants to install at the bottom of the launch ring, and also against the claim the launch pad is going to require no refurbishment at all between launches. These parameters are incompatible. Let's say a Starship takes 5 seconds to leave the pad after the first flames hit the pad plating. According to Musk, that means there will be up to 5 inches of erosion in the plate, meaning the top plate alone has to be at least 5 inches thick to withstand that punishment before melting right through into the water cavity between plates. 5 inches is roughly 12.5 centimeters, and we're going to add the metric now. The base of Booster 7 was 9 meters across, but Musk has already said those plates will extend further out from the OLM to cover more surrounding area. Let's say he intends to use a plate measuring 12 meters across instead of 9, for an extra rim of 1.5 meters around the outside. That gives us an area of 113.1 square meters on top of a cylinder 12.5 centimeters high, with a resulting volume of 14.14 cubic meters. Basically, no matter how it's segmented, you're looking at a giant steel coin as the top plate. A cubic meter of steel weighs around 7,850 kilograms, a little under 8 tons. So that works out to 111 tons of steel in the top plate alone. Steel that will be eroded at 1 inch per second in these conditions and will have to be replaced after every launch. That doesn't exactly sound like zero refurbishment in between launches. It's like nobody at SpaceX knows how to run numbers anymore. At 4230, he gives his idea of a timeline as follows.
I think I'm upbeat about the next 12 months. I think we're going to get to orbit, and then it'll probably take us a few more years to achieve reusability on a regular basis, where we bring the booster back and bring the ship back. Where it'll take a few years to get to where Falcon 9 is today, where it is now quite normal for the rocket to land.
Honestly, it's not even worth talking about timelines at this point, since SpaceX is grounded for the foreseeable future. At 43 minutes, Joey's back asking about the environmental groups upset about the damage. Here's the question, the answer from Musk, and Tim Dodd's imbecilic interjection on the topic. You'll see what we mean.
There's a lot of opposition from these environmental groups in the area over the debris, and I just wanted to kind of get your reaction to that, since some didn't expect the debris to go as far as it seemed to go. And if there is a legal challenge in court, either against SpaceX or the FAA, how would SpaceX respond, and what would that do to the timeline?
Yeah, I think, if you say, like, for practical purposes, if you were to look at an aerial picture of the area, and apart from the area around the launch stand, tell me where things are damaged. It's actually, I think you can't even see it at this point. It's not like the rocket, uses non-toxic propellants, so it did scatter a lot of dust. To the best of our knowledge, like, there has not been any meaningful damage to the environment. That we're aware of.
And to be honest, I was out there at the pad 2 days after. There's a huge storm on Saturday, like 70, 80 mile an hour winds.
Yeah, that was intense.
And like, I saw more debris coming off the shore from like people's docks falling into the water and like capsized boats.
Yeah,
that's true.
And I did anything more than just some bits of concrete, which yeah.
Again, it's beyond obvious that Musk is not acknowledging the damage he did to the surrounding area, to the tune of about 385 acres according to estimates. So God help Texas and Brownsville if they don't grab him by the scruff of the neck and smarten him up. They're only shooting themselves in the foot if they let him skate by pretending nothing bad happened here. And trying to compare the damage that Musk did to the nesting grounds to some dock wood that Dodd claims to have seen on the shoreline is absolutely pathetic. Now let's learn a couple of things about the Raptor engines themselves.
The Raptor throat, we believe, is the highest heat flux of any human-made object ever.
Whoa.
Is it somehow that plasma has to go through a throat? How did that throat not melt? That's crazy.
And literally, how does it? It's just from a massive amount of film cooling and regenerative cooling?
Yeah, I mean, it's getting cooled, it's like getting crazy regen cooling, and like we're flowing, liquid methane at extreme pressure, 11,000 psi through the jacket, so it's ripping. And then combine that with foam cooling and the best thermal barrier coatings we can come up with. But it's still shocking that we do not vaporize the throat of that engine immediately.
That has to make people feel safe and comfortable that they're in good hands planning a trip to the moon, eh? How does that engine not vaporize its own throat immediately? Musk asks. Well, they do. Musk told you as much during the Starship presentation in 2022.
We assume the next booster is going to require, Raptor 2. So, kind of where are you at with the production and the testing so far?
The only remaining issue that we're aware of is melting the chamber. So, if that thing really wants to melt,
Huge issue with the engine, which we probably watched play out every time we saw green flames spat from the back of Booster 7, because that color comes from pieces of copper in the engine getting caught in the propellant stream and being vaporized. The engine will not function properly afterwards without all of its parts. But cue the standard Musk justification word salad to make it all better.
This is what's needed if we're to become a spacefaring civilization and build a base on the moon and a city on Mars and multi-planet species, which is, I think, a super exciting future. And I mean, at a high level, the super cool thing here is that, hey, this thing kind of works, and we're going to solve the issues that are remaining, and we'll get it to orbit, and we'll make it reusable, and that means that we have a real path here to get humanity to Mars.
And here's where we put the goalposts back to where they were for our very first episode. Even if, against every law in physics, Musk manages to get this behemoth safely to orbit at any point in the future, it is still never getting humanity to Mars. If you want to learn why, you can start at our Debunking Starship Episode 1 and just keep watching. Every video in that series remains every bit on point now as it was 3 years ago. Nothing has changed. Next question is Michael Sheets from CNBC.
Hey, Elon, this is Michael Sheets at CNBC. Quick question on the launch tower side of things. Have you cataloged the damage to the equipment? I mean, it looks like some of the tanks were hit by debris and there's quite a lot scattered around. Can you give us like a rundown of what you guys need to replace versus repair?
We're going to be replacing a bunch of the tanks in the tank farm, but these are tanks that we wanted to replace anyway. We're going with more of the vacuum jacketed kind of giant hot dog looking tanks. Those are in the best shape, and those are what we want anyway. The tower itself is in good shape. No meaningful damage to the tower, even though it did get hit with some pretty big chunks of concrete. Hopefully be ready to fly again in a couple months. Once again, excitement guaranteed, success is not.
So the tank farm they're planning on replacing then would be the ones they just finished installing in October of 2021. So they're maybe 18 months old. And they're shot to shit now with pad shrapnel, so they're garbage. Maybe, just thinking out loud, if they hadn't been parked 80 meters away from the OLM, they could have survived more than one launch. But, to be fair, they weren't safe anywhere inside a 1-mile radius of this destruction epicenter. Now Musk wants them swapped out for more like the current methane tanks, which are only 60 meters away from ground zero, and how the hell they survived this debacle is a complete mystery. The locations of these tanks has to be of concern to any government authority reviewing the site at this point. How can they possibly be okay with that location? And from this point of the interview on, it's just repeated questions and Musk saying he'll do another update at a later date. So here's our takeaways. First off, Booster 7 was obviously a junkyard version of the rocket that never should have been given a green light. The launch should have been given every chance of success, but wasn't. Summarizing what Musk has said about differences between Booster 7 and his next bombshell Booster 9, Booster 7 used an assembly of outdated, unreliable Raptor 2s, where Booster 9 engines will all be from similarly dated batches and have a higher degree of reliability, according to Musk. Booster 7 had to be retrofitted for heat and blast shields. Booster 9 shields will be more built in, according to Musk. Booster 7 hydraulic gimbaling controls will be replaced with electric gimbaling controls, and future launches, presumably including 9, won't have a central nexus in control of multiple engines, such as 7 did. And apparently nobody working on this rocket thought of that problematic point of failure before. In short, in his own words, Musk had a much better vehicle option available to him, with better controls, engines, and shielding, yet launched the inferior machine anyway, basically just to clear the pad on the Stoners' national holiday. That's what it comes down to. 2 years they had to work this thing out, since SN-15 landed and caught fire, and what they launched in the end was a subpar version of an already dubious vehicle. Second, Musk's dismissal of the damage caused by this launch just shows he is absolutely, in no sense of the word, a responsible steward of this area, and has no respect for the sensitivity of the area. And third, Musk is long overdue to be interviewed by someone who will stand their ground with him and make him explain himself. Enough with the sycophant softballs like Dodd or Ellie or Manley. When do the people who can think for themselves get a shot at him? Musk needs to get asked the hard questions, needs to take responsibility for the damage he caused, needs to be made aware that the days of skating by on his lies and false promises are coming to an end, and he better start positioning himself accordingly. He can start by taking complete ownership of this failure, starting by publicly acknowledging it was a complete failure, and without being prompted or forced, conduct the clearing of debris from the area as described to the letter in their signed agreement of September 2021 with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Then he should lock the gates at Boca Chica until such time as he has permission from the TPWD, the USFWS, the FAA, and the state to resume operations, because at this point, that is not a given. After that, if Texas and the FAA are stupid enough to allow him to launch from Boca Chica again, when NASA has blocked Musk from testing and launching at Cape Canaveral, even though they have multiple contracts on Starship's fate, then the FAA and Texas can dig their own graves. As it is, the FAA is already in hot water over this launch, as they are being sued by a coalition of groups for their failure to perform an adequate EIS on SpaceX's program at Boca Chica. In fact, we got a copy of the official legal filing that we're going to walk you through, but only the highlights of the introductional paragraphs. On May 1st of 2023, the FAA and the director in his official capacity, named Billy Nolan, were sued by multiple plaintiffs including the Center for Biological Diversity, African Bird Conservancy, Surfrider Foundation, Save RGV, and the Carrizo Comecrudo Nation of Texas Incorporated. This will be a landmark case concerning whether the nation's commitment to preserving our critical wildlife habitat and treasured coastal landscape must be sacrificed as we reach out to explore the cosmos, basically asking the court whether the destructive wake left behind by Musk is worth the cost of having access to space, which Starship honestly isn't capable of delivering on anyway. In paragraph 2, plaintiffs identify the FAA as the federal authority over the launching of vehicles into space, who has authorized the Super Heavy Launch Vehicle program at Boca Chica, Texas, without complying with bedrock federal environmental law and without fully analyzing the significant environmental and community impacts of the SpaceX launch program, including destruction of some of the most vital migratory bird habitat in North America, and without requiring mitigation sufficient to offset those impacts. Paraphrasing paragraph 3, the plaintiffs claim the FAA's PEA and resulting FONSI ROD was relied upon to issue the commercial space transport license on April 14th that resulted in the April 20th disaster. Paragraph 4 goes through the stats of the vehicle and the negative effects for the area, including intense heat, noise, and light that affects surrounding habitat areas and communities. Paragraph 5 states that although the FAA stated they were temporarily grounding the rocket after the April 20th disaster, they have not withdrawn or modified the FONSI ROD, which was obviously poorly conducted, nor has it announced any plans for a supplemental review process pursuant to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Paragraph 6 details how the area is surrounded by biologically diverse and essential habitat areas, including many federally protected animals that are also sacred to the Carrizo-Comecrudo people. It's set at the center of a national wildlife refuge, 2 state parks, a state wildlife management area, and a state coastal preserve. It is also essential area to migratory birds of North America. Paragraph 7 identifies the history of at least 8 explosions on the site, which is being extremely kind, some of which have caused significant brush fires in the National Wildlife Refuge. It continues on to say the US FWS has found prior SpaceX rocket explosions have harmed protected wildlife and designated critical habitat in violation of the Endangered Species Act. And paragraph 8 lays out all the complaints of frequent closures of public roads and beaches totaling over 100 dates per year, far in excess of what is permitted in the agreements that are signed by SpaceX. We've heard much of this before, and it has always fallen on deaf ears. Maybe this time, in federal court, they'll take notice. In paragraph 9, the plaintiffs take direct aim at the FAA's Chief of Staff of Commercial Space Transportation, who initially stated that the FAA planned to conduct a new environmental impact statement for this program to analyze the environmental impacts pursuant to NEPA. However, and this is extremely important, the FAA instead delegated that decision to SpaceX and did not prepare an EIS to analyze the launch program. Rather, based on SpaceX's preference, FAA relied on a programmatic environmental assessment PEA prepared by SpaceX for NEPA compliance, followed by the FAA issuing a mitigated finding of no significant impact, a FONSI, that obviously failed to account for this situation. This is something we picked up on in our episode called SpaceX Boca Chica Draft PEA Teardown, where we noted who actually created that report. We had intended to go through this 150 plus page document point by point with our concerns, but we note that this document was not created by the FAA. This document was prepared by 3 environmental engineers who are SpaceX employees, and 1 employee named Brian Pownell, who is a transportation engineer working for a consulting firm named Kimley Horn & Associates. That firm seems to specialize in large city-scale infrastructure projects rather than anything remotely environmentally friendly. And that is absolutely going to be one of their key arguments. Paragraph 10 correctly states the proposed mitigation measures in the PEA are insufficient, and the FAA failed to explain how the mitigation measures would properly address NEPA standards. Paragraph 11 of the introduction states that the proposed mitigation measures are inadequate to prevent the SpaceX launch program from causing significant environmental harm, which was demonstrated perfectly by the amount of damage to the immediate area, without even having the vehicle explode on the pad, as so many expected would happen. It states clearly and accurately that no mitigation efforts have been imposed to prevent or minimize anomalies in the first place. Paragraph 12 claims FAA violated NEPA by failing to consider a reasonable range of alternatives, having only considered SpaceX's proposed project, and not properly considering the Kennedy Space Center as a viable alternative location, where Musk is already building a second location anyway. As we've noted before, geographically, Boca Chica is a terrible launch location, as the only launch azimuth they can aim for is the very thin corridor of space between Florida and Cuba without invading another nation's airspace. Paragraph 13 claims the FAA failed to take a hard look at the environmental impacts of the program, including the increased light, heat, and environmental pollution, risk of wildfires, damage to critical habitat, and the program's contribution to climate change. And the final paragraph 14 sums up the points, so here it is verbatim. In sum, the environmental impacts of the Starship Super Heavy Launch Vehicle program cannot be reduced through mitigation, such that the FAA can ensure that there will not be significant harm from the launch program, and FAA failed entirely to even address how the proposed mitigation could achieve that level of protection. Therefore, the FAA's failure to fully consider and address the impacts of the Starship Super Heavy Launch Vehicle program through an EIS, including the impacts of the failed April 20th launch, and its failure to consider alternatives that would reduce the impacts of the launch program, was arbitrary and capricious, in violation of NEPA and the Administrative Procedure Act, APA. The court should vacate the FONSI and accompanying record of decision and remand with instructions that the FAA perform a full EIS. That's as far as we're going to dig into this document for now. You are welcome and encouraged to read through the entire document to see how the plaintiff defended their claims, but the long and short immediate impact of this case is if the FAA licenses another launch while this matter is still in the courts, and it goes the same way this one does, or worse, the legal shitstorm that's going to rain down on the FAA and SpaceX will be able to fertilize these protected habitats for decades to come. Now, just as we're wrapping up this episode, we find out that SpaceX has joined the FAA as a co-defendant in this case. And we're willing to bet it's because everyone knows full well that the draft PEA that SpaceX wrote and the FAA signed off on is going to get burned to the ground in federal court and result in the full EIS that should have been conducted in the first place if things were done properly, which we know SpaceX cannot possibly pass. Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Common Sense Skeptic. It's always interesting when doing these longer shows to see how much new information comes out after we start writing the script, and how much of that information tends to verify exactly what we're putting together. If you enjoyed the show, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're having debates about any of these topics with your friends or family, be sure to share the link with them. Also, since we're working our way towards the 100,000 subscriber mark and our silver play button, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel and ring the notification bell so that you'll know when The Common Sense Skeptic returns.